you a dialogue-focused writer? I very much am, and I'm going to break down how I make sure I am getting that really strong dialogue, but also not forgetting my world building in today's episode. So a dialogue-focused writer is going to be somebody who pays really close attention to the dialogue that you're writing as you're writing it. And when that happens, you tend to get like 2 pages of back-to-back dialogue without any world building in it. And sometimes you can stop and you can add things in, but for a lot of people, that will disrupt the flow of the really strong intentional dialogue. If you're constantly stopping to talk about how they moved or the world building or how the way the birds sound or the way the room feels, you're going to lose some of the punchiness and the importance of the dialogue that you're doing. And you may forget where you're going, or it may not be as strong or cohesive or nailing those things that you want to get done. And so with that in mind, what I do when I get into a segment where I'm just back-to-back dialoguing and I realize it, I leave it. I just keep going. I push forward with the dialogue. And when I get to the end of that section, or when I get to a section within that dialogue where I can pause to decide where I'm going next, because the banter had been so good, I just focused on that. Then I can go back in and add some of that world building. I do that before I leave the scene. That is not something I do later on. A lot of people will go back and add it in during a second, third, 14th draft. I don't do that. I make sure I get to the end of the dialogue, the end of the conversation that is very important and very forefront of my mind as I'm writing. And then I'll go back and I'll add in that world building, because that world building is very important to know where they're going, what they're doing, how people are interacting, how people are engaging. And if I don't have that before moving on, I might not have what I need for that next scene. I can very heavily rely on my world building and what's happening and what I'm doing outside of that dialogue to then inform the very next step. So while you can do it in whatever staging you want, what I do is when I find myself with that back and forth banter, I just lean into it. I give myself permission to write the dialogue, and I assure that as I'm writing, I have the good dialogue tags and I identify who's speaking and what's going on so that I know exactly what's happening. Sometimes we identify those things by the world building. So when you go back to put the world building in between some of those sentences, then you can kind of change that. But if you are dialogue heavy, tag every line so that you know who said it, especially if there's more than one person in that conversation, so that you know exactly what's going on. And if you randomly think, oh, and this person then lifts their hand for emphasis, write that in. Do not feel like you have to forego the world building if it comes to you while you're writing. But while you're writing, if you are just so into this back and forth banter that you're having, embrace it. Just write the story that is playing out inside of your head as you are thinking these things through. Just write what is motivating you right this very second. Then when you get to the end of that conversation or that scene, now pop yourself back up and you don't even have to read the whole thing through. Just look for the sections that need to be broken up by a paragraph of description, or if you need to add things in around dialogue tags to enhance what you're doing. Go back and look visually, where does this look like it's a problem and I need to break it up a little bit. Look at those sections and then add something in there. You can then enhance your world building from there. You can then do further world building in a subsequent draft, but you just want to make sure visually this looks like you're not going to have to slog through it to get to the end of the conversation. Yes, we really want to be able to see the dialogue, and the dialogue should be the focus. The dialogue is what's going to be moving that story forward in most cases. So your world building is secondary to the conversation that you are having, but you still need to have it there. And like I said, a lot of times it informs what's coming next. If they're walking and they stop, that's a different type of conversation that they're going to have than if they were just stopped the entire time, or if they continue to walk the entire time, or if they are moving, if they're doing things, if people are around them, the way that they're engaging during different parts of this conversation is important for us to get a full picture of what's going on. We're painting that visual picture with our world building, and that is something that if you're a dialogue-focused writer, you sometimes just kind of skim over, so you can go back and add that in and then use that to either continue the conversation or to move on to the next scene. A lot of times, your world building is also good for foreshadowing and sprinkling things in. So if you're like me and you get really into that banter and you just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, do all of this really great conversation, then jump back up before you proceed to add in some of that world building, to make everything make sense, to break it up visually, and to make sure that people are really getting a fully painted picture of what is happening during that important conversation that you can then use later on in your story. And then again, as you are going through this, if you're somebody who does a lot of subsequent drafts or even one follow-up draft, you can add more in, you can tweak more things, you can do stuff, but make sure you, from a visual perspective, you are getting those things in there, because world building matters to your word count. We can write our story and be very dialogue heavy, but we're going to have a very skewed word count by the time we get to the end of it if we're not putting that world building in. I add a lot with world building. I can write a really strong passage with dialogue, but when I go back in to add in that world building, that's a lot of words, like a lot of words to connect things and draw that visual picture that I'm then adding. And if I just said, well, I'll do that in the next draft, I'm really not going to have a very good idea of how long this book is going to be, of what I am doing or where I'm going or how I'm doing these things. So I do encourage you, and again, you don't have to, this is up to you and your writing style and your personality, but for most people who are dialogue focused writers, I recommend get your fire dialogue down, and before you move on scenes, now go back and add some of that world building in. You can sprinkle a little bit more as you do your editing later on, but like make sure you get it in there because it's important. It's important for a lot of reasons, from your word count to knowing how much you need to flesh out in other areas or how much you need to like pull back in other areas. It helps you to guide what's going on in the world and give that visual picture, but it also helps to inform what you're about to write next. So I do recommend having a fully fleshed out scene by the time you're done before you move on to the next scene. But you have full permission to write your burnin' dialogue. Burnin'? That was a weird one. You can write your dialogue, write that fire dialogue, and then go back and add the world building in, and then be able to move forward from there. Have that fully fleshed out scene before you move on. Trust me, for almost all of you, that's the way to go, especially if you're dialogue focused like I am. If you are dialogue focused, drop it down below. If you're world building focused, drop that down below too. And if you are somebody who is just like a magical little unicorn who just does everything really, really well as you're going all the time, let us know that too. A lot of the time I can get most of it as I go, but sometimes when I'm in those like back and forth banter moments, I'm very dialogue focused. I gotta go back in and fix those things later on. So we want to hear from you. How are you writing? What are you writing right now? Let's get into the conversation and build up the community in the comments down below, and follow along for daily videos helping you navigate the world of publishing, from your writing to your publishing to your marketing, to make this your most profitable year ever with the least amount of stress, overwhelm, and time commitment on the content you're creating. We'll see you then.